Have you ever wondered how senior leaders in the world's top corporations polish their presentation skills? Stay tuned to this edition of Talk Shop Interviews. Just because someone has the top position in a top corporation doesn't necessarily mean that they are a natural or even particularly skilled speaker. No, what they do is they develop their skills and polish their presentations with the help and assistance of people like Tom Mucciolo, one of the world's top business presentation and speaking skills coaches. Tom Mucciolo is founder and president of MediaNet Inc., a presentation skills company in New York City. Tom is a recognized industry expert regarding visual communications and business presentations. Since 1985, he's served as a presentation skills consultant for senior leaders and top corporations such as IBM, Microsoft, Dell, and Toshiba. Tom brings not only his business and sales savvy to his work, but also a strong theater background, having trained with the legendary Robert Lewis, founder of the famed Actors Studio. Tom is part of the faculty at New York University as an adjunct professor in communication effectiveness. Mr. Tom Mucciolo, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm very excited to have you on board. I met you in Edmonton when you were doing a series of one-on-one coachings as well as corporate training with a variety of our big companies over here. And just so that people have an understanding of the depth of knowledge you have when it comes to corporate speaking and public speaking, how long have you been in this industry for?
So I started my company in 1985. So it's going on a little over 33, 34 plus years. And pretty much I started actually as a computer graphics company. We were designing slides at the time, actual 35 millimeter slides, color overheads. Electronic images were possible using certain devices, but you used to have to rent a very large projector, these huge Sony 3-color gun projectors that had to be wheeled in with the truck. So there were no real portable projectors at the time. They started to come into existence around the early 1990s. So for the most part, much of the work was actual 35 millimeter slide presentations. Color overheads were possible. They were expensive, but that was the majority of the work. But starting around 1986 or so, 87, the director of training at New York Life Insurance asked me to come watch the actual presentation that he was giving. So I watched it, and at the break, he came up to me and he said, "It's not really going very well. Do you think it's the colors or the fonts?" And I started to watch him as an actual presenter. I said, "Well, John, it's you.
Yeah.
What's the problem? So you're all over the place," or there were certain things he was doing non-verbally that were very, very distracting. So I worked with him for an hour or two, and he says, "You've got to work with our sales force." So that really led to me adding all of the non-verbal communication skills that actually happen to people when they're speaking, different from the content that they're presenting, which is a separate design issue. And that's really sort of what changed the focus of what I did. I started focusing on the delivery skills, which were really plaguing people.
For sure. And in terms of the delivery skills of corporate speakers, because a corporate speaker, I would say, is a bit different from something that you would see on, the ever popular TED Talk stage. There's maybe some of the mannerisms are similar, but their purpose is quite different. So in terms of those really top performing corporate speakers, what do you see them doing that lets you know that, yeah, they give an outstanding business presentation?
So I've had the opportunity to do some research in this area over several years, and I found that the ultimate skill that audiences prefer in a professional speaker is self-confidence. If you actually attend a conference and you watch someone speak and you don't really think they own the material, you're probably out. You're probably not as interested as you were before. Oh, I apologize for that.
That's okay.
Sorry. Didn't think I'd have a phone ringing behind me, but every now and then that's going to occur.
It's the plague of our modern age.
Exactly.
So that self-confidence is really, really critical.
Yeah, self-confidence is literally the biggest challenge for presenters, and it's shown not only in how they deliver the information, but it's also shown in how they sort of couch their material or their message. And
Hmm.
that's really where the skill comes in. If I had to pick the top level skill of a professional speaker, it's, do they really own the material in a way that the audience already believes them to be an expert? Then you can continue from there. But if that piece is missing, I think you're going to have a pretty big problem.
I completely agree. And when people have asked me about, what is this whole, what's the problem of looking nervous? Is it okay to say that I'm nervous? My comment is, if they are going to have confidence in your material, you have to show them that you're confident in what it is you're saying. You need to basically tell them how to view you. So where are the top 3 mistakes? Of course, you mentioned that confidence is the big thing, but the top 3 mistakes that you see corporate speakers make, what are those?
Well, I would say the initial mistake that they make is probably in the nonverbal parts of the communication. So that would be, how quickly does someone, for example, see the palms of your hands to offer that concept of trust? And there's a history about that. But that would be one element, is do you look approachable? Do you look immediate? Is there a way that someone says, gee, I can ask her a question, I can chat with her? So that's sort of the first thing, is, are they connected to an audience or are they removed from an audience? That would be one of the first things I would look at. The other thing is, do they interact in any way? So I always ask the presenter, I say, are you prepared for questions? And they say, oh yeah, they can ask me anything. I said, no, what questions will you be asking? What actual questions do you have for an audience so they can get involved?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times these questions are a form of interaction that gets a group of people to say, all right, I'm willing to play. I'm willing to participate. And if that occurs, if the question issue can occur, then you've got a chance to have other voices speaking, different sounds of people in the audience. There's a different energy when audiences respond. And so those are things. And then the last thing would be the content piece could be a problem. So if you have visual support, the question becomes, is the visual support readable or viewable? If it's readable, it probably stands alone. I really don't need you as a speaker.
Yeah. Why is it there if I can just see the handout or look at it on screen?
Yeah, if it really answers every question on its own, I really don't need you to talk about it. However, if the content is designed in a way that teases me but doesn't please me, if there's a way for me to go, okay, I'm looking at what you're showing me, but I really need more help, I'll probably listen. So really good speakers remove the distraction of too much content that becomes readable rather than just viewable. And that could be a downfall for the presenter if they begin to narrate the content or get involved with the content too much.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially if they're accustomed to using their PowerPoint slides as a script. I mean, that happens constantly, or they look at the image and begin describing exactly everything that they see on the screen. That sort of distraction happens a lot.
Well, some people use the support visual content as a way to get through the content, and that's fair.
Yeah.
You're not going to memorize a table of numbers because they're a table of numbers. Now, what you're going to talk about on those numbers would be what you would have remembered. My view is very, very simple. If you put something on a slide because you thought you would forget it, you probably went too deep into the weeds, because you've seen it more than once and can't remember it. I'm seeing it once. Why would I remember it?
Mm-hmm.
So I look at it by saying, you probably went too detailed. Now, it's different if you had a different type of an audience. Maybe you're teaching something. You're teaching a process. And you've got a group of people in the room who are learners, and they're actually listening for a different purpose. They need to learn something. So you may have to have heavier content, more repetition, people being asked questions based on what they've learned. That's different than a type of presentation that you may typically experience in the corporate environment, where there really is no test after this.
Right. And so when you're in the process of deciding whether or not to even use a slide deck, this is something that I've heard quite often. Well, slide decks are just, PowerPoint is terrible. Usually there's one software they pick. PowerPoint is absolutely terrible. I've switched over to Prezi and it has changed absolutely everything. Then you go,
No, that's actually a pretty awful slide deck as well. So there's this eternal debate almost, and it's PowerPoint presentations, slide decks. Are they the speaker's friend or are they the devil's work?
So the concept of the tool you use to create visual support is basically the tool itself. That's not the problem. That would be like saying, you decided to write a letter to someone and you used Microsoft Word, but you can't write. So I go, well, I think the problem is you don't understand how to write, not that it's the software. So I would look at PowerPoint saying the software, whether it's Prezi, whether it's PowerPoint, whether it's any other vehicle you would like to use to create an image to support content or any visual, it's really in the designer.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to be hung up on saying, well, PowerPoint is bad, just a tool. However, I will agree, poor PowerPoint is bad.
It really is.
Yeah, so poorly designed content is a problem because now you have to present it. This is, I don't know, if Shakespeare used a better pen, would the writing be any better? I'm thinking the concept is, and probably a quill pen at the time, but what I'm thinking about visual design is the content moving you through the logic, supporting you, so that you still look like the expert, not the narrator? And if the content is distracting, whether it be the movement of items on the screen, the amount of content, or the disjointed graphic elements that may exist, that really would be a problem for a speaker.
Mm-hmm.
And
for sure,
that's an issue.
For sure. And just to reiterate again, it's not the software people. It's that you don't know how to design a good slide deck.
And now that you also asked another part of this question, which do you even need a slide?
Yes.
So this becomes a really interesting issue. If you have no visual content, you actually could be a better speaker because you have less to manage in front of people. You don't have to advance slides, address them, talk to the content you design. You actually can just extemporaneously speak. Yes, some people do have speeches written for them, and that's another skill in the reading of a speech, whether you use a prompter or written speeches in terms of print. Those could be problems, challenges. But if you add visual design, you get this one other element that's really interesting that audiences prefer. The fact that it's been designed makes it more real.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really interesting phenomenon that if we read something in a newspaper, it actually happened. But if someone tells us something happened, we might agree or might not. But once it's in print, it's been prepared. So there is a slight advantage to having some prepared material that is your way of saying, I have a visual version of this, and I'm willing to show it to you. And if you disagree with it, it's already visible. So it also gives you a second element. People can stop looking at you. Eventually, they have to look away. So what will they look at? If they can look at content, then they get the mix of visual design plus presenter, and it's an actual pretty good mix. And that is a critical skill for an audience. It's kind of like watching a movie. You're not always looking at the faces of the actors. Sometimes you're looking at scenery. So imagine a presenter sometimes doesn't want the audience looking directly at them. They would like the audience to look at something else.
You need a break from the face every now and then.
Right.
For sure.
Like this interview. I think people are going to get tired of looking at my face after a while. So I'll switch to another face.
And back and forth and back.
But as you can see, when this is a different situation because we're chatting, but in a real presentation with visual support, an audience starts to watch the presenter, sometimes look at visual content, they look off, then they look back at the presenter, then they look off again. So this is action by the audience to feel that they are involved in a holistic view of content.
Mm-hmm.
I think the best way to look at PowerPoint is it's speaker support. It's not speaker.
For sure.
And if you'd like to add it, just design it so that it supports what you're saying without saying what you're saying.
So to that end, if you had to give just a couple of rules of thumb for people with absolutely no visual design sense, because the visual design is a skill in and of itself, but for those who have none, a couple of rules of thumb, what would you say your top would be for designing good slides?
So let's separate slides into two categories, ones that have graphic elements and ones that don't. So the ones that have graphic elements, you just want to make sure that the graphic elements you use take advantage of depth. So imagine if you had slide content with a few words on it, would there be perhaps a photo in the background or some depth? That's a possibility. So that would be one version of someone who's not a designer, but they say, you know, I'd like to talk about teamwork. I wonder what photo would fill the background of this. Second thing is, another graphic element actually is color. So you have to make sure that the background colors of your slides are always darker than the foreground elements. This is the rule of visibility from a distance, kind of like how your road signs work. They're darker from a distance with bright letters. The credits at the end of a movie is white text on a black screen. So the rule of visibility from a distance is when the backdrop is darker and the foreground is brighter, since white is the presence of all light, it comes at you. Black is the absence of all light, it moves away. So if you had black text on a white screen, your text is moving away. Well, that brings us to the second piece of the problem, text, slides that have a lot of text. So my rules are very simple. Can you make sure that no bullets are full sentences? Can you make sure that no bullets wrap to a second line? That you never have more than one indented sets of bullets? Or else you'll be nesting. There'll be a subset, another subset. It'll keep indenting until the edge of the slide is reached. So we don't want to do that. But one way to do that is can you make the actual slide readable, or I call it viewable, so there's not a lot of reading, but can a person step through the content in about 8 seconds? And you could leave the slide up for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
If I can look at your slide and I see, let's just say you had a bullet point that said data integrity. I'm stuck. A split second I read it, but then I have to go, well, what's she going to say? Now I have to look at it. But if you had the Webster's Dictionary definition of data integrity, I've got to read it. And so that leads us to the last problem of visual design. It's called respect. An audience starts to listen to you speak. And they say, you know, I respect her. She's an expert. You know, I'm going to listen to her. Whoa, whoa, look at that. She brought a slide. Oh, my God, look at all the words. Well, you know what? I have respect for her, so I'm going to do what she wants me to do. I'm going to read that slide. Now, I know you're talking, young lady, but no. I'm reading your slide. Now, that's exactly what's happening. Meanwhile, you're saying, stop reading the slide. Please listen. So my first question with all speakers is, if the slide is very readable, do you want us to read it? If you say yes, don't talk. But no one would do that. So you make the slides less readable, and it triggers you for content. And this goes back to, do you know the content? Or did you go too deep into the weeds that you needed paragraphs of information? Now, I'm giving you generalities, right? There are many situations where people say, I'm sorry, this is a working document. We're learning how to fix this contract. Okay, well, that's a meeting.
Yeah.
But in a presentation, usually you've got anywhere beyond 5 minutes of uninterrupted discussion where you're talking, which means it's a presentation at that point. The simpler it is visually for the audience, the easier I believe the audience will have, or the ease they will have in listening to you as a speaker.
That's outstanding. So everyone who is listening, everyone who is watching your next slide deck, listen to this last 5-minute clip again and again and again, and you will have an outstanding slide deck the next time you go to present. Now, Tom, you also have some really excellent insight regarding positioning and proximity. Maybe some of this comes from your theater background, but when you were talking about that during our initial meeting, I was really blown away. So could you share a bit about how we as presenters should be working our space when we're presenting? Like, what do we need to consider when we're positioning ourselves?
So if you imagine the concept of proximity, the closer and closer that people get together, the level of intimacy rises. So obviously 2 people dancing have a different relationship than 2 people on opposite sides of the room. So when a person is speaking, there's a depth factor that audiences see when you're standing with some visual support. You have to imagine the proximity of these items. The visual support is typically behind you. I know there are exceptions. Screens could be above your head, but in the typical scenario of someone presenting material, and let's just use a conference room as an example because it happens very frequently. Something's on a screen, you're standing closer to the audience for a few feet away, and they're sitting at a table, which means there's some depth. So the body can create levels of intimacy, if you will, or closeness by moving closer or farther away. Now, a person shouldn't move around a lot, but if they move in very simple defined spaces, either closer to the audience, possibly between the screen and the audience, and closer to the screen to refer to content, now we get the concept of depth, just like the way cameras work. Cameras zoom, they don't pan. How could you watch a movie if you had to keep doing this? No. So we know we use the zoom technique to get closer. In the theater, actors use staging. Sometimes they're upstage, farther away from people. Sometimes they're downstage, closer to the audience. And without this movement, it's hard to really get a feeling of the reality of it. So this is why lecterns are a very big challenge for presenters, because they're not moving. So therefore, audiences tend to not look at the speaker if they're not moving. They'll look at the content, which means you lose a lot of that body's language. So I find that the concept of depth is a very critical one for affecting the audience. Just like in the movies, there are wide shots and there are close-ups. And so if those things can exist from a camera's perspective, they certainly exist from the perspective of our eyes. And that's a movement element. So you can change these concepts over the course of time because you may not have a big space to present it. And sometimes you're sitting like I am. So there really is maybe 3 spots that I'm moving to. One is the way I am now. This might be a big picture with my head back farther, and this might be closer to you. See how little, there's just a little bit going on. So when a person is presenting, this becomes an amazing skill that people can adapt to create the nonverbal cues that people use to become more effective as speakers.
Now, in terms of how we can look comfortable in front of people, because of course everyone gets a little bit nervous up in front of their audience. It's not just the newbies, it's the highly experienced CEOs as well. For looking comfortable and looking confident in front of an audience, do you have a favorite position or stance?
So the goal is to get a chin over a knee. You know, the Italians in art came up with the term contrapposto, which really was, how do you make statues look like they are alive or have been alive or are moving? So they basically shift the stance, if you will. The weight is on one foot, but it's really not on the other foot. So if you were to stand and both of your feet had the same pressure on the floor, your chin would be in the center of your body. So you would find yourself having very symmetrical gestures. You would look very rigid. You wouldn't look like you own the content. You don't have a relaxed stance. But if you shifted your stance to one foot, or you shifted it to the other foot, your chin would actually be above your knee. And if you lifted your hands, they would be perfectly three-dimensional, different heights, different depths. And when people see a relaxed stance, not a lazy stance, not that you're leaning on something, but if they see someone with a relaxed stance, they say, that person owns the material. Look, soldiers stand at attention, generals relax. So
that's a good way of putting it.
So in reality, the first thing I'll look at is, does the person look relaxed as a speaker? And if they do, then when they move, it's going to look natural should they choose to move closer to the audience or farther away. I mean, the rule of movement is very simple. If your slide content is busy, you should be closer to the slide so people can compare what's on your face to what's on the slide. If the slide content is less busy, you could be closer to the audience. So that allows a person to move occasionally in front of people.
Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I cut you off there.
Yeah, that's okay.
Returning the floor to you.
No, that was what I was getting to, was you can use movement to your advantage, but these non-verbal cues are what audiences watch in the stance to see, do you look relaxed? Do you look like you own the material? Lecterns are a problem because you tend to mirror the box itself. You're actually behind it. And the lectern served only one purpose if you go through history. The reason they were developed was for religion. And religion worked like this. Things were on scrolls. There was only one of these gigantic scrolls, and they were very heavy. Well, where could you put them if you want to use your hands? You'd have to put them on something. So they developed this box, this lectern, to hold the scrolls so that the people in the religious section could say the prayers, gesture to heaven, if you will, or upwards, and their hands would be free, and these would be rested. They also kept these lecterns to protect people from their nervousness, because the center of the body the skeleton doesn't close. So we like to block the front of the body. And a big problem that happens in speakers is when they don't have a lectern, they have one way to block the front of the body, and that's their hands. That's right. So if your hands come together, you're going to find so many problems will happen as a speaker. Your breathing will change, you will start breathing during your phrases, not between phrases. You'll start having more fillers because the hands are in front of the body. The diaphragm, lower part of it is compressed slightly. It's just not a good situation. So lecterns actually serve the purpose of sort of blocking the front of the body.
So as much as possible, ditch the lectern, stand like Michelangelo's David.
Well, yes, that would be
Maybe
one
not
way.
full.
Yeah, maybe not exactly like that. Yes.
That sort of idea.
Have a relaxed stance. If you really take a look at the Italians, the Greeks, their statues pretty much are contraposed. And art, Renaissance, take a look at paintings, you'll see the same thing. That the characters are in a position that looks like they could have been moving or were moving. And that doesn't mean everyone is like this, but I typically see with presenters, I like to see them be relaxed. Then they're going to be more natural in their conversations.
So with all of that, bringing it home, I'm going to get you to distill this into one sentence. Your number one piece of advice to corporate speakers, what would that be? Shift
your stance, show your palms, smile. I mean, that would be my summary.
It's simple and it's beautiful. I love it so much. Well, thank you for joining us here today, Tom. Again, you bring a wealth of wisdom in this area to this show, to our viewers, to our listeners. I'm sure that they'll be able to make lots of use out of this advice. So again, for those of you watching and listening, go through this interview again, make notes. Your next presentation will be that much better for it. Now, before we go, Tom, where can people get more of you?
So I have a website, medianet-ny.com, and it's also connected to a blog, the Visually Speaking blog. But the thing I like about the blog is I added this learning module, which is basically free for everybody other than just putting in your email so you're not a robot. And pretty much you basically have access to a lot of videos and a lot of information about nonverbal communication. And that's free for people. There's handout materials. Most of them are in narrative form. There's no pictures in these handouts. There's pretty much just narratives. But those would cover a lot of different topics on messaging, perhaps something on small group communications, things of that nature. And the only book that would serve a purpose for people right now, because I was part of this research that we've done at New York University, where I'm part of the faculty, was to study what were the 21 skills that audiences identified as being important for all public speaking, whether it be teaching or presenting. So we built the first book based on student learners, but it works for professional learners as well, called A Guide to Better Teaching. And it's all 21 skills, 11 of them in your personality, 5 in the content, 5 in the performance. And there's even an assessment tool that is part of that you can actually begin to measure your skills so you can improve. And that's available on Amazon, so it's a published book called A Guide to Better Teaching. If someone were interested in developing or honing one or more of these 21 skills, to say, well, how do I do that? It's one thing to have self-confidence. How do I actually practice it?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And everyone, head to medianet-ny.com. I've got the links just down below. Go to the Visually Speaking blog, download that learning module. I did. It is wonderful. And yes, I can definitely attest to the quality of those 21 skills and the evaluation tools. They are wonderful. And of course, for everyone out there, if you would like to hear more wonderful interviews from people like Tom, who bring true expertise to your communication in a variety of circumstances, head to laurensergi.com and sign up to receive the updates so you do not miss another one of these videos. Again, Tom, thank you for being with us here this morning. Thanks to everyone who is watching. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Lauren. I really appreciate it. You take care now.
You too. Bye-bye.